So, and our speaker tonight is Mrs. Gremillion or Minios?
Connie Gremillion.
Okay.
That's right.
And you can tell them about yourself, some of them.
Well, I'm going to tell you about the book that I wrote, that Neil published. That's why we're here, to tell you a little bit about not only the book itself, but the process of publishing. So I'll take you through the book at first, about the research and this kind of thing. And then Neil will talk about publishing it. So it's been a wonderful journey with Neil, and those of you that have read the book, you recognize what I'm talking about. I hope you find it interesting. Who are the Acadians? They are the descendants of early French pioneers who came to North America in 1604 to establish colonies in and around Nova Scotia. Once these colonies were formed, this broad area was named Acadie. The early Acadians lived happily in Acadie for 100 years, until France lost the colonies to Britain in 1713. Under British rule, the Acadians were forced to pledge their allegiance to Britain and renounce their religion or face exile. They refused. And beginning in 1755, the Acadians were loaded onto ships and then dumped in ports along the eastern seaboard. The exiles no longer had a country and were treated with contempt and hostility wherever they went. During this time, Louisiana was under the rule of a Spanish government that was friendly toward the French. This government extended an invitation to all Acadians to come to Louisiana. After years of travel, surviving illnesses, hunger, and mistreatment, approximately 3,000 refugees arrived in South Louisiana. Along the quiet riverbanks and across the vast prairies, the Acadians found a new life in New Acadie. Louis Pierre Arsenault left Beaubassin, Nova Scotia, sometime after 1755. 30 years later, in 1785, he built this home for his family near Carenbrook, in an area subsequently named Beaubassin also. Not far from Arsenault's home was a trading post on the Vermilion River named Petit Manchac. Many Acadian families settled in this area and established a town named Pinhook. In 1835, the name was changed to Vermillionville, and in 1884, Vermillionville became Lafayette. This 1880 sketch shows Lafayette's earliest businesses, which were established around the Chapel of St. John, on land donated by John Mouton. Now, 125 years after the exile of the Acadians from Nova Scotia, these courageous people were recognized as teachers, doctors, trappers, fishermen, merchants, farmers, plantation owners, and statesmen. They were the people who built the towns, churches, and schools. Oscar Dago was a direct descendant of Chevalier Dago, one of the earliest of the French pioneers who came to Canada from France in 1604. Chevalier settled close to what would become Acadie. After France lost her Canadian colonies to Britain in 1713, he left Canada. After 7 years, he arrived in Opelousas, Louisiana. The year was 1720, 35 years ahead of the Nova Scotia exiles. In Opelousas, he received a government land grant and moved to the area where Church Point now stands. He married an American girl, Marianne Taillon, rumored to be an Indian princess. They had 2 children. The son, named Joseph, married Lise Dupré from France. 7 children were born. One of the sons was named Francois, who married a wealthy and land-rich girl named Leocadie Boutreau. Her ancestors were from Nova Scotia. Francois and Leocadie had 5 sons. The oldest was Oscar, born in 1869. This was not an ordinary Acadian family. Not only did Oscar's parents own a great deal of land, Francois was also a businessman and a statesman, serving as a senator of Louisiana until his death in 1874. After his death, Oscar's mother, Leocadie, divided some of the land between the 5 sons. Oscar received approximately 2,000 acres near Lafayette, where he established a plantation. The boundaries of the plantation ran from present-day Congress Street north to I-10 and from Moss Street west to Scott. The records which outline Eliza's ancestry are not as clear or as exciting as Oscar's. However, the Landry family was a typical Acadian family with both sides, mother and father, having an unbroken line of ancestors from Nova Scotia to Louisiana. During the late 1600s, Abraham Landry lived with his son Rene in Nova Scotia. The only way we learn the family has left Nova Scotia is the record of the marriage of Rene's son Olivier in 1775 in the Ascension, Donaldsonville area of Louisiana. In 1810, Olivier's son Fabian moved to Opelousas, where he married. In 1845, Fabian's son Symphorian moved to Lafayette and married Estelle Granger. They had a son, Charles, born in 1852. Charles Landry married Marie Idia Chesson in 1872, and the newlyweds moved to Cogelet, which is now called Broussard. Census records listed Charles Landry as a farmer. He later opened a saloon and became a successful businessman. They had 8 children. The second oldest was Eliza, born in 1876. When Eliza was 17, she met Oscar Dagle. He was 24 years old and a successful plantation owner. When Oscar asked for Eliza's hand in marriage, Eliza's mother, Idia, was against the marriage. She told Eliza she would not be happy living on a plantation and associating with the plantation workers. You should hold yourself apart from those kinds of people, she told her daughter. After all, they're freed slaves. Determined to prove her mother wrong, Eliza married Oscar in 1893 in the chapel of St. John. And so begins the story of a house for Eliza. Lafayette was a very different place in 1893. There were no hospitals, gas, or sewage. Everyone had wells or cisterns and outhouses. It would be 4 more years before anyone had running water and electricity. The streets were dirt roads, narrow and dusty, with sidewalks made out of wooden boards. This was the first year for telephones in Lafayette, and there weren't too many of those either. People were still spinning cotton to make clothes and making dye out of tree leaves and indigo. A wooden bridge at Pinhook Road connected Lafayette with Cogelet and was heavily traveled by buggies and an occasional vehicle which had a seat with 4 wheels and no roof. At the bridge, the banks of the Vermilion River were steep, making it difficult to see the water below. Down the river on the left bank was the sawmill, and a little further down on the right bank was the grits mill. If we could ride with Oscar and Eliza in their surrey as they returned to Lafayette from a visit to Cogelet, this is what we would see. After crossing the bridge, Oscar and Eliza were on Pinhook Road. On the left was the old Bayou Inn, one of the oldest structures in Lafayette. It has been called many names since then. Today it is the home of Cafe Vermillionville. Jim Higginbotham's shop was next. He made spinning wheels and hickory chairs with rawhide seats. Ogden's saddle shop was further down, closer to Lincoln Avenue, which is now Jefferson. Once Oscar and Eliza passed the graveyard, now called the Protestant Cemetery, Oscar turned the surrey to the left onto Lincoln Avenue. This was the main street of Lafayette and was lined with businesses. Near the center of town, on the right, was the Sans-Souci General Store. Although this picture was taken later, the store looks much as it did in the 1800s. On the left was Mount Carmel Academy. Oscar's father, Francois, donated a portion of his land to build the school, which began as a boarding school for girls. This is the curve in Lincoln Avenue, which was often crowded with automobiles and horse-drawn buggies at the same time. The telephone poles are in small clusters because not everyone had telephones. Today, the Moss Pharmacy building on the right is still standing and is named the Moss Building. The People's Bank was the first bank in Lafayette and one of the last buildings on Lincoln Avenue. It was later named First National Bank. Lincoln Avenue ended at the Lafayette Gazette building, which stood where the old Daily Advertiser building now stands. Here, Oscar turned the surrey left onto a grassy lane which led to his plantation. This grassy lane would later become College Avenue and then University Avenue. Near the present-day Congress Street area, Kane Fields marked the entry into the plantation. In the fall of each year, from the grassy lane, you could see workers harvesting the cane and loading the wagons for trips to the sugar mill, which was near Cogelet. The house which Oscar built for Eliza lay deep within the plantation and was exactly like the one in this picture, which was also built in 1893. The wide front porch and lack of traditional garçonniere was typical for the time. There was a large live oak tree to the right of Eliza's house, its branches touching the soft prairie grass. In the back of the house there were orchards of orange and pecan trees, separated from the house by fences laced with muscadine grapevines. Behind the house there was a barn, and beyond the barn a crawfish pond and a peanut field. For miles around, cotton fields stretched like clouds as far as the eye could see. The first day Eliza saw the house and the plantation, she was overwhelmed by the size and beauty of the land. Never in her life had she seen the horizon quite like she saw it that day. One by one, she met the plantation workers who lived in little gray houses strung like pearls in the distance. In the months that followed, she learned to love the plantation life and the workers as well. She did not have much time to think about her mother's objections to her marriage, and her fear of the workers and living on the plantation faded like the colors in an old dress. The workers in the cotton fields spent long hours in the hot sun, picking cotton as the plantation foreman on his horseback made certain the bags of cotton filled quickly. Often, when the moon was full, Oscar allowed the workers to pick the cotton at night. The heat of the day is gone, Oscar said, and the workers can finish an entire field in one night. It was Eliza's first September on the plantation. The full moon rose late and hung close to the fields like a huge silver disc. Eliza knew the workers would pick that night. She stepped into the yard behind the kitchen. The workers with their dark skins were hidden now. In the moonlight, Eliza watched the balls of cotton dance in the darkness as though suspended in midair before they disappeared into the white sack. Eliza always remembered that night and reminded herself that she was indeed blessed to be part of such simple beauty. Many times Eliza watched the children pick cotton with their parents. She tried to guess how old they were and wondered about her own children and what kind of life they would have. Eliza and Oscar raised 17 children on that plantation, and for many, many years the land took care of them. There was a lot of illness in those days, that's true, and bad storms that destroyed orchards and barns. But there were good times also, filled with laughter, boucheries, and buggy rides to school. Eliza felt she could protect them as long as her children were little. But as they grew, the problems grew also. It was a long way for a doctor to travel when one of the children got sick. The weather was harsh with frequent windstorms. Going to school for the children meant a long buggy ride in rain and cold and sometimes snow. And then another problem surfaced. Because the house was isolated, wood thieves were able to steal their precious firewood off the front porch. This was perhaps the last straw, because shortly after a visit by the thieves, Oscar made plans to build a new house for Eliza in the city. The house was finished in 1921. The address was 705 College Avenue. By then, the grassy lanes had turned into streets, and everyone had running water, electricity, and telephones. The roads were crowded with automobiles, horse-drawn buses, and buggies, all on the streets at the same time. The younger children were able to walk to Mount Carmel, and the older ones could walk to SLII, established in 1901. Oscar was still the master of his plantation, and during harvest time he spent long days and nights supervising the workers. Life in the city was different for Eliza, and the years seemed to fly by. She missed the plantation, though, and decided the family should spend the summers in their old house on the plantation. Once there, the children became children again, counting pictures in the clouds, playing in the hayloft, and riding horses bareback in the sunset. Back in the city, there were also happy times with graduations and weddings and grandchildren, until the Great Depression, when lives were changed forever. As the financial turmoil tightened around the plantation, Oscar found himself unable to take care of his family. There was no money to pay for sugarcane and cotton, and the only thing of value that Oscar had was the land. By the mid-30s, Oscar was able to sell some of the plantation land, and with that money, the family was able to survive the Depression. After the land was sold, Eliza felt a deep sadness settle in her heart. Now the memories of the plantation were all she had left. The scars of the Depression and 2 world wars were softened by the joy and adventure this family experienced during a time like no other. The children were now adults. All the family graduated from Mount Carmel and SLI, which is now UL. 3 of the girls became Mount Carmel nuns. 1 of the boys became a Christian brother. Another boy became a priest. 2 of the boys served in the military, one in World War I and another during World War II. The rest of the children became teachers. Oscar developed pneumonia during the flu epidemic of the 40s and died in 1946. With Oscar gone, Eliza turned to her deep faith and trust in God. Twice a day, she walked to Mass at the Cathedral of St. John. As she grew older, she had more difficulty crossing the street and often had to ask for help. A large department store called Sears and Roebuck was moving into Lafayette and offered to buy Eliza's land. At first she said no, because she did not want to lose the house. When she discovered the house could be moved to a piece of land next to the cathedral, she agreed. As soon as the house was moved to 512 West Convent, Eliza put on her new hat and her pair of white gloves and walked to Mass at the cathedral without having to cross one street. All of her memories had followed her, and she lived happily at that address until 1958, when she died of heart failure. All of her children, except one, were with her when she died. Eliza and Oscar Daigle were both buried in the Cathedral Cemetery, directly behind the church near the crucifix. The Oscar Daigle House is one of the Lafayette Parish historic properties and is still located on West Convent Street. The pictures in this presentation were taken from the following sources: Lafayette City Parish Register of Historic Properties, Images of America, Lafayette, Cajun Country, Images de Lafayette, A Pictorial History, and Lafayette, Its Past, People, and Progress. Eliza and Oscar Daigle raised 17 children who became part of the greatest generation. They lived through 2 world wars, numerous illnesses, tragedies, and monumental discoveries. They never lost faith in God or in one another. Thank you.